Today I'm going over every single book I've read so far this year to wrap up the first quarter of 2025. Since I don't do like monthly wrap-ups, I figure quarterly wrap-ups are probably the best way to go. And I'm super proud of this list because every single one of them has been off my 2025 TBR list, which is very unlike me because I am a huge mood reader and I don't often stick to my TBRs and instead find myself going off and reading whatever I'm in the mood to read. But I'm not going to waste any more of your time. I'm going to jump straight into the books I've read this year, starting with the very first book of the year, which was Taliesin. This is book one of the Pendragon cycle, and if I'm being completely honest, this isn't one of the most underrated books I've ever picked up. It's probably the most underrated book or series that I've ever picked up. And that's not to say it's a perfect book. It's not. I have a lot of criticism for it, things I can nitpick about it, but it's far better than your average read. And honestly, it's just about unspoken of on BookTube. And most of what I have seen about it on BookTube, I've had to specifically search for, and it doesn't come up naturally in my feed. Taliesin is an Arthurian story, or more specifically, it's the prequel to a prequel of Arthur. And I will be doing a full review of this book of Taliesin, so I'll probably just finish by saying that this book has a little bit of everything for everyone. It follows the destruction of empires at their peak. It follows the pagan tribes rising up to fill that void that these empires at their peaks have left in their wake, have left in their destruction. It has religious elements, and it's got romance that is way better than anything you see in today's like modern romance fantasy. And it's funny because I don't think this is marketed as a romance book, but it is definitely romance. If you're looking for an underrated series to jump into, I cannot recommend this series enough. So after I read Taliesin, that brings me to the second book of the 2025, and it's the sequel to Taliesin, and it's book 2 of the Pendragon cycle called Merlin. And Merlin, in my opinion, was even better than Taliesin was. In Taliesin, I almost preferred the second half of the book over the first half, whereas in Merlin, it was incredible from start to finish. It follows Merlin from boyhood to Druid King to Madman, and then eventually Keymaker Advisor and Druid Bard of Legend. I think besides the fact that I think it was more consistent than Taliesin was in its quality, I think there are scenes in or even chapters of this book that go toe-to-toe with some of the greatest books of all time out there. And you do get that in Taliesin as well. There are scenes that have literally seared themselves into my mind, but I think we get more of them in Merlin. And after reading the second book of the Pendragon cycle, I really wanted to jump straight into book 3, which is Arthur. It's finally getting to Arthur in the Arthurian legend. Not only because I was having such a great time in the series, but because something I'm trying to do this year is read entire series back to back, rather than what I've been doing for the past 2 or 3 years since I've been on BookTube, which is to spread my series out over months or years and reading as many authors as I can in as short of period of time. And now that I've done it both ways, I will say that I really prefer to read series back to back rather than spreading them out. However, I've been listening to these books on Libby, which is a free library app. And unfortunately, there was a super long wait for Arthur to the point where I actually finished Merlin before Arthur became available. So the third book of 2025 is not Arthur, the final book of the Pendragon cycle, but a different series altogether. Because it became available to me on Libby sooner than Arthur did. And I've actually already made a video related to me reading this, even though it was not a review. It was a discussion about romantasy in general, but the book that inspired that discussion was Fourth Wing. It's my third book of 2025, and if you remember in my 2025 TBR video, you'll know that I wanted to read Fourth Wing specifically to see if modern romantasy was actually romance. And it turns out I was completely justified in my assumptions about quote-unquote modern romantasy, because this book wasn't romance at all. It was porn.
But you got porn!
And you can see all that in the video I made discussing the topic if you want to delve into it further and hear more of my opinion on this subject. But I want to talk a little bit more about the book specifically, because I think the worst part about this book was that outside of the porn, the truth is that Fourth Wing is, how do I say it? It's a fairly well-written, fast-paced, plot-driven Dragon Rider YA novel that I could have recommended to people as a kind of like a fast-paced palate cleanser between denser reads. Because it wasn't perfect, it had a lot of flaws that would make it so that I would never consider this book great, but it was decent. I think a great book needs more than just a good plot to be great. I think the characters in this book, for example, are just terrible. Something I've found is that the best authors, the ones that truly stand out, write really good characters. And the sign of good character writing is the author doesn't have to say so-and-so said at the end of their sentence. We can tell who said it based off of how the character is speaking. And this author fails miserably at that. All the characters kind of feel the same, and the only one that is different and not like all the others is, in fact, the main character. So without the porn, this probably would have ended up being like a low 3 stars. But because the purpose of the book is not the story, but the porn, I personally am not going to continue with the series, and I can't recommend it to anybody. I will, however, have a lot more content on the book, or surrounding the book at least, including a review of the book itself, and then a discussion about the difference between porn and then literature that has sexual content in it. Because that's a common subject that was brought up in the comment section of that video I made. So you can expect to see a lot more of that content moving forward in 2025. So with Fourth Wing out of the way, that brings me to the last 4 books I've read so far in this first quarter of 2025. And I've read these last 4 books back to back, and they have absolutely blown me away. Like, to the point that I think I've already found my books of the year with this series. It was that good. I will have hours and hours and hours of content on this series coming out later this year and probably a little bit early next year. And that series is Book of the Long Sun by Gene Wolfe. And I'm sure that doesn't come as a surprise to you for anyone who's been following the channel for a while. Gene Wolfe has become my favorite author of all time, and I don't think anything he writes is less than a 4 out of 5 stars, with most of the books I've written being 5 out of 5. The Book of the Long Sun includes Night Side of the Long Sun, Lake of the Long Sun, Chaldea of the Long Sun, and Exodus of the Long Sun. And at the point that I'm recording this video, I actually haven't finished Exodus. But I know that by the time this video is posted, by the time this video comes out, it will be done. I'm going to attempt to summarize the book a little bit for people who might be interested. And like Book of the New Sun, it sounds crazy to try to summarize this series in just a sentence or two. I would describe it as a priest who turns to thievery for the good of his community. And while he sets out on this type of heist, he ends up communing with God, solving mysteries, and starting a rebellion along the way. Like, it absolutely blows my mind that a series with that premise can be this good. Like, I have no idea how Gene Wolfe sat down and thought of this character and this story and was able to execute it in such perfection. Like, the main character I can only describe as a priest version of Sherlock Holmes / James Bond, and that combination doesn't sound like it should work. It doesn't sound like anybody should be able to write a story that is cohesive and makes sense with that type of character at its forefront, and yet Gene Wolfe sticks the landing perfectly. Like, he writes one of the greatest series of all time using a combination that would be almost impossible for anyone else. And like I said, I'll have a ton of content coming out surrounding this series and Gene Wolfe in general, because it was kind of blowing my mind. When I was reading this book and taking notes, I realized that even though Gene Wolfe has become my favorite author since starting BookTube, and I mention him in almost every single video I make nowadays, I realized that I don't have much Gene Wolfe specific content on the channel. I think I have my review of Shadow of the Torture, which is like what you should know before starting Book of the New Sun. And then I have my Wizard Knight review. And I think that's it. I think those are my only 2 Gene Wolfe specific videos. And as I was jotting notes down on this book, I started to realize all this really good Gene Wolfe specific content. So I've got a whole bunch of great ideas written down, and we'll be working on those and producing those later this year. And with the amount that I've written down, it'll probably go into early next year as well. So with those 4 books knocked out, that wraps up my first quarter of 2025. It was 7 books in 3 months, and I did a few really cool things. I started a book series that is probably the most underrated fantasy series of all time. I finished a series that is probably going to be my read of the year. And lastly, I read a book that solidified my opinion that modern fantasy romance is just porn marketed as romance. As far as my next quarter goes, I imagine I'll probably finish the original Pendragon trilogy with Arthur. I'll probably read that. But I honestly don't know where I'll go from there. The Dragonbone Chair has been on my mind more and more recently, so maybe I'll jump into that book and do a reread of the Dragonbone Chair and continue with that series. But at this point, it's too early to tell. I am still a huge mood reader, so if something else on that 2025 TBR calls to me a little bit stronger, I'll pursue that instead. But besides that, thanks for watching.